Hello, I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute, an institute for the humanities, an alternative college and high school here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. Here we are in our 11th year live broadcasting thanks to your generosity and recording. Tonight on the topic of philosophy and history. And very shortly, Professor Adam Myers is going to have the floor here talking about something that clicked lately with him when it came to the world of ideas and how those ideas are lived in this world. By way of a plug, I hope appropriate to this topic, I myself have lately produced and written and published an essay entitled We Are the Marsher Lords. And one of the points I bring up in that pedagogical essay, which is freely available on our site down in the description and on the Chiron below, is the very fact that the internal world uh, is the manifested external world. So every physical thing that we're seeing, which was made by people, the computer shelves that this is on, the computer itself, the cups that Adam and I are drinking from to keep us awake at this hour. All of these came from ideas which began inside of people. And long story short, on this essay, which you can download and read, is that we really need to get a lot deeper in terms of pedagogy, educational philosophy, than we are. Even those of us who have made our critiques of the mainstream, we also have to check ourselves. So anyway, that's waiting for you. And also, I'll double team it here. Professor Myers is available for tutoring at the Institute, and just write us at our regular email address for details or if you have questions about that. And of course, Adam is a whiz, more than a whiz, an expert really, in mathematics and logic and so forth. So if that's what you have a need for to learn that in a truly thorough fashion, do get in touch with us. With that, I'll put a sock in it. And my purpose in the remainder of this live broadcast recording is to simply pretend I know nothing about these topics, and as uh, unversed as them as some native on an island in the middle of nowhere. So anyway, Adam, welcome. I hope the day is going well for you. I know it's very busy, so thank you for your time, and take it away.
Well, basically, my ideas are coming from a philosopher called Hegel. For those who aren't familiar, Hegel is more or less the philosopher of modernity. It is, in my opinion and my understanding, that he basically is the person who is most responsible for World War II, in the sense that the three dominant inheritors of his legacy were the main actors and players of World War II and the following Cold War. So, understanding Hegel is, in a certain sense, understanding modernity and the 20th century itself.
And those actors, would they be Mussolini, um, Stalin, and Churchill, Roosevelt?
Yeah, more or less. Yeah, and then Hitler with Mussolini. Yeah. So, I mean, in of course, Japan. It's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly who in Japan, but the Japanese society at the time. Um, Basically, the three main inheritors are what we may consider left Hegelianism, center Hegelianism, and right Hegelianism. The right Hegelians became the fascists, the left Hegelians became the socialists and the communists, and the center Hegelians became the liberals. So that's from where I'm coming from, what I'm seeing from Hegel. Hegel himself was a member of the school of idealism. The idea of idealism is that because our interactions with the world are entirely through our experiences, our sensations. By that, by that they're not meaning like, you know, your ability to take in wavelengths of light through your eyes. They're not talking about the ability for sound waves to bounce off your eardrums. What they're saying is the sensation of what it's like to hear, what it's like to see, what it's like to feel. These sensations themselves at their core are your only real experience with the world. They sort of postulate that the world itself, in a certain sense, comes from this, that the material world, the world outside of ourselves, is questionable whether it even exists at all, or if it's really just a construct of our phenomenological world, the world of experience and sensation. And Hegel took some of these ideas and he projected it into his understanding of history. And he was trying to understand how history developed. His basic thesis was that there were, well, this is one of the terms, that there was an initial idea, a thesis, an antithesis naturally arose in conjunction with the idea. They battled, whether physically or ideologically, and then a synthesis, a sublation of both, which kind of contained the best parts of both, arose out of that to become a new thesis with a new antithesis pair, and so on and so forth. This was, in a sense, how history was generated. So, and in Hegel's mind, there was a clear progression towards increased liberty, and that's kind of what for Hegel is the main understanding of what history really is. This sets up what's called Whig historiography later. Um, but the basic idea is, society, worried about deprivation and banditry, seeks freedom from this by electing a tyrant to be in power, right, to stop the bandits. But the tyrant brings an unfreedom of his own. And so the people go, okay, well, we need to have some kind of counterbalance to keep the tyrant in check. We don't want the open banditry. We're not going back to that. We also don't want the tyrant either. We want something kind of in between the two. And so you might get like a priesthood or something like that to try to keep the monarch in check. And then that itself becomes a new thesis with a new antithesis, and history continues to progress.
Can I interject here? You used a word here, in case we're unfamiliar with it, Adam. We know the idea of history, the doings of the past before this moment. You used a word called historiography as regards Hegel. What is that? What is historiography?
Historiography. Um, Actually, I think you would probably be the best one to answer that, being a historian.
All
But
right.
I mean, as far as I know, it's the study of historical writing. But feel free to take it away.
Yes, exactly. There you go. You're just as good as anyone else. So history, as I said, is the doings of the past. Historiography is just that. It's the meditation or the focus or the study of how history has been presented. So, for example, I'm speaking, I assume, to mostly an American audience. Um, Almost every one of us has read a book, a play called The Crucible by one of Marilyn Monroe's husbands, Arthur Miller, who is buried about 12 miles away from where I'm recording this. Arthur Miller. He also wrote Death of a Salesman. The Crucible is, on one level, a look at the Salem witch trials. In reality, Arthur Miller wrote that about what he considered to be the injustice of the communist investigations in the 1950s and the idea of the witch hunt. For various reasons having to do with the 50s, Miller could not bring that up, or felt he could not bring that up. So he wrote a meditation on the 1950s and so-called McCarthyism set in the 17th century in Massachusetts. So that's historiography. And fast forward now so many years, so many decades, we think when we're reading The Crucible in high school, we're learning, quote unquote, about the Salem witch trials. We're not at all. We're learning about Arthur Miller's meditation about the 1950s, 300 years later from the time that the setting is. That's a nutshell of what historiography is. The historiographer is super interested in how the presentation of history is influenced by the time period that is being presented. So Adam gave a good nutshell. I gave a bigger version, but I don't think as good as he did.
No, I would push that back to you. You're the expert. I would not have been able to go that much in depth. My understanding is more from the philosophy and abstract side, rather from the more real and concrete. But yeah, that's the in essence. I would say that that's the essence of what Hegel really is. That's sort of the essence of his ideas, ground down to the most basic and superficial. Like, I'm not really going that far in depth. There's a whole concept called negation that you can get into if you're really into Hegelian philosophy, and you know where he was going with that. But that's where I would first set things up. So
Great. So very good. So carry on with your line of thought there, Adam, please. You
well,
had built up with Hegel and you made
yeah,
some reference
yeah,
to the 20th century. Yeah.
yes. So the interaction between thesis, antithesis, and synthesis forms what's called the dialectic. It's sort of like an argument between two people, and at the end of the argument, the idea is that everybody walks away better off. Like there's a better understanding of the dialogue, and there's sort of this abstract concept of dialogue where the instead of individuals arguing, it's elements of society that is they're effectively arguing, and the argument can be a literal conflict, like a war, or it could be a debate or a political campaign or whatever. Um, each of the main inheritors of Hegel, I would argue, lost something crucial. And that was an understanding that not everybody's interested in the Hegelian dialectic. So, whereas the fascists, they sort of, their position was that the state should control the dialectic in its entirety. I mean, that was their basic thesis. That was their basic statements. Like, we think that the dialectical process, this idea of the evolution of society, should be regulated by the state, right? We shouldn't have just random revolutions that just randomly pop off. We should control the evolution of history itself. And that requires totalitarianism. Combine that with Hegel's idea of what's called the big man or the big man theory of history, which is pretty routinely attacked in history. The idea is that you would typically have like a supreme leader, some exceptional individual who could take control over history and push through the obstacles. A very heroic way of looking at this person, and that's where the fascists took it.
Hmm. Yeah, and just to interject, whether it's the liberals or the democracy, so called, or the fascists or the communists, just to interject and maybe to enrich this, you have to understand out of the Enlightenment that the state structure and the state apparatus is supposed to be if you'll forgive the language, the incarnation of the people's will. The
Mm-hmm.
state and the policeman who pulls you over in this strange sense is you. You have delegated, you, the citizen, have delegated your power.
Mm-hmm.
That is the same in communism, fascism, and liberalism. That idea that the state is the visible expression of the people. So just to understand this, this may sound very strange to us in the 21st century, but it wasn't 100 years ago.
Right. Yes. And whereas the communists took it a completely different direction. So whereas the fascists and the liberals were both idealists, they were still saying ideas are what form. Whereas the fascists were very concerned about how the methodology of the dialectic. Liberals were more just like, well, freedom is the thing that's happening. Like we don't really have to do anything; it's just sort of automatic. And the communists and socialists, the Marxists in particular, Marx and Engels, their interpretation was that Hegel was wrong about idealism, that the world's actually materialistic, that ideas not only is the external world all that exists in the concept of materialism here, it's serving two purposes. There's metaphysical materialism, this idea that the mind and physical sensations are actually emergent out of the material. It's emergent from the external world. The internal world's from the external. This idea of like if there were a soul, it'd be a physical entity, that kind of thing. All the mind is just a brain and some signals. Like that idea is materialism. Marx also uses it in a different way. So not only is he meaning it that way, but he's also meaning it historically. So he believed in what's called dialectical materialism, he and Engels. And the idea here is that instead of it being a thesis and antithesis between two different concepts of freedom, he sort of thought of it more like power relations between the powerful bourgeois class and the weaker proletariat class. And his idea is that the progression of history is really just these two factions fighting over over the material conditions. And for Marx, everything that exists comes out of the material. So things like ideas, like as John was mentioning, with like the coffee mug being an idea in someone's head, Marx was like, no, 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 it's the other way around. The material conditions for the coffee mug first existed, and then you just decided to create a coffee mug. But the only reason you create a coffee mug is the material conditions were there to allow it in the first place. That's the direction that Marx and Engels would go with that. And so you can, hopefully, the audience can kind of see why these three factions were pretty much at each other's necks during the 20th century. And I largely laid this at the feet of Hegel. Hegel is the mastermind behind this, although he probably wouldn't have taken credit for it. I don't think that he would have realized this is the direction that things were headed in at the time.
One question before we get on with Hegel, and a question I have myself, Adam, just to clarify. Um, OJAS Patel asks to our previous recording, why is the other guy naked? Would you tell us a bit about your mind about normalizing nudity, and my mind as well? Go on.
Oh, sure. That's definitely out of the box. The situation for me is that I genuinely am just more convinced by what I call the nudist argument or the nudist cause, more so than the textile argument. And what I define as the textile argument is this basic idea that you know, the state of nudity itself is a problem, that the public shouldn't have to experience seeing naked people walking around. Whereas the nudist argument, in my mind, is simply the refutation of this, that there's nothing wrong with that, or if not just that, possibly society might actually be better off if we allowed this to happen and encouraged it. And I actually happen to be more extreme in that particular matter. And so I, as a practice, seek to be as publicly nude as possible to advance this cause, simply due to the fact that, like I said, I find their arguments the most convincing. When you go, whether it be the environmental arguments, whether it be the social arguments, whether it be the psychological arguments, whether it be the restrictions on the power of the government to regulate clothing, what people are required or not required to wear, whether we're talking about health benefits. I mean, really, nearly every single argument in favor of nudism is superior to the argument against it. I mean, everything as simple as, like, just as an example out of my hat, and probably the one that's at the top of people's minds in this matter. What about children? What about children seeing nakedness? And it's like, when in reality, it's actually far more harmful for kids not to see nakedness and not to have frank discussions about the body anatomy. In fact, many of if people recall, there was a mass surge in child molestation by members of authority, particularly in the Catholic Church a few years ago. And a lot of that was allowed to continue because the children didn't have the correct terminology. They couldn't describe what was happening to them, and they were so ashamed because of the body parts involved. So, and there was a clear correlation that's been seen, where the more shame in the household, in regards to the human body, the more likely there is to be these types of issues, and the harder it is for kids to report it. So, in fact, the very argument you might try to use to defend textilism is, in fact, one of the best arguments against it. Think of the children. Yes, think of the children. Children should know the proper names for body parts, and people should be more sanguine about their own bodies, more at home and more comfortable with them. It's not a big deal. It really isn't. And again, society simply benefits by being more upfront about this.
Great, thank you for that, Professor Myers. And I hope that OJAS Patel has his answer to the question, why is the other guy naked? I'd be naked too, except that it's somewhat chilly. I want the window open for the fresh air, so I flaked out. But there is a reality to our main discussion here about Hegel and the Enlightenment, and even 19th century. We've moved on from that by the 19th century, but there was certainly a philosophical focus on, is the external world imprinting on me, or, as I suggested in the beginning of this recording and broadcast, is the external world actually a projection of me, at least in the physical, human-made parts of that, the buildings and so forth. And there's a very similar correlation, I think, to what you were just saying with nudism, um, and the way it's framed. Like, I don't want to see uh, someone naked. Right? I mean, there's a whole perception of the subject and the object in that, which I think is similar to what you're saying about Hegel.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. So, getting on the on ramp there, having answered the question, and we welcome the other questions. That was from YouTube, and I think on certain platforms that may not be as easy to do, but you can always send us correspondence through our email in the description. In any case, Professor Myers, continue on. Though you were talking about Hegel, and then the splits of Hegel and how they manifest in the 20th century.
Well, so my basic my basic idea here is that Hegel missed something important. So he got a few things right. Some of it I think is wrong. I disagree with Marx very strongly, but I think there's something critical that he missed out on. Because what Hegel did is he sort of swept the people that didn't like the thesis with the same group of people who also disliked the dialogue. So the antithesis and those who were opposed to the dialogue itself were sort of made into the same thing. And I think that's a huge mistake because they're not the same. There is a very big difference between the antithesis of the thesis and people who are opposed to the conversation itself. Because they seek to so Hegel is talking about some kind of progression. There's this idea that you get the thesis, the antithesis, they get together, and something is born from the union that's better than both, right? And history sort of just evolves in this direction. There are people who just don't like the concept of evolution itself, and they wish to make things go backwards. They don't like the new; they like the old. And they not only do they like the old, they like the older, even the older that they have themselves not experienced. They have a nostalgia for the past and for the ancient past. And this is what I call the countersynthesis or the countersublation, right? This is this desire, this yearning for the system that has evolved, this better union we've created, to borrow from the Constitution, to in fact go back to the way it was, to the less good union, perhaps in some minds. And this need for backness is, in my view, completely absent from Hegel. It's he acknowledges it. He acknowledges it, but he doesn't acknowledge it as like a force unto itself. In his mind, it seems to be more for like the antithesis, from my understanding of Hegel. Again, my very limited understanding of Hegel. And so I think that the countersynthesis plays a part. And when the countersynthesis isn't allowed to play its role, when it's not allowed to be a part of the conversation itself, when it's not allowed to have a space, what I call the reactionary space, it tends to get a bit violent. And it tends to subvert the dialogue itself to make it more destructive. So, because typically what you want is you want a mediator between the countersynthesis and the dialogue. So you want this sort of meta synthesis, meta dialogue going on, this meta dialectic, where there's a conversation happening between the dialogue itself and the countersynthesis, right? To put this into more concrete terms, right? Suppose we have a city that's developing, right? There's a law they're trying to pass, and the law is trying to regulate the wages of taxi drivers. Okay, just as a hypothetical. Now, suppose outside the city in the rural area, there's an Amish county, right? And suppose, just for hypothetical reasons, the Amish are politically involved in the city for some reason. I'm not going to explain why. I'm just trying to quickly get through the example. Okay, the Amish don't necessarily like the conversation between the taxi drivers and the taxi cab companies, who are never going to fight over this law. They don't really have a dog in either one of those winning. What they don't like is they don't like the laws of the city to affect their community. They could care less what the laws are. They are counter-synthetic to the dialogue itself. So, there might be some debate between the two. We get some sort of negotiation. And now there's this law about taxi cab companies that might actually impact the Amish because, they have horse and buggy that might be defined as a taxi, whatever. They don't like that law for completely different reasons from the taxi cab companies. They're not in the same group. And when they're ignored, they can become quite, they can make their voice heard louder than people would like. Because what typically tends to happen is they tend to muck up the system. Instead of this law being written with the explicit knowledge that there are people like the Amish where we're not gonna affect them. We're gonna specifically be like, okay, this law is only for taxi cabs, like actual cars, not horse and buggies. And unless they did that, then you can have that better stability. You have that negotiation with them and the Amish. Because by them not doing it, they bring the Amish into the equation. And the Amish have, like I said, they have no dog in the fight. They don't care who won or why. They just want the law undone. They want the conversation to go back to the way it was.
This almost reminds me during the strange COVID-19 drama, the rabbinic Jews in New York City. This almost, we can change the scenario, but it reminds me of the Jews in New York and Brooklyn, who are fighting against the vaccines and the closing of the synagogues and so forth, and it fits very close to this idea of the Amish.
Yeah, yeah. And the Amish is just like a group that I just chose. It's literally anybody who's conservative, but conservative has more baggage than I'm saying Amish. And like it's a bit, I think people are less emotionally charged for that term. But I mean, that's functionally what it is. It's simply just any group that's more traditional, that's oriented more towards tradition, whatever that might be. And so I think that in a well functioning meta dialectic, you're going to have the dialectic, you're going to have the counter synthetic, you're going to have a mediator, and then you're going to have two more roles. You're going to have the outside, because even with the meta dialectic, there's stuff outside the meta dialectic, there's stuff that's ineffable within the totalizing framework. And you have to have a word for that. You have to have a space for it and understanding that it's going to be there. And then you have to have a way of interacting with it. And so there's sort of the outsider and the void that also show up there. But once you put this together, I would argue that forms a complete framework for the dialectic that I think is sorely missing. And again, you don't really want to ignore the counter-synthetic because it's not pleasant when it gets ignored for too long.
So we see the Second World War as being the collision of these different, maybe schools of thought. Post-war, we have the Soviet Union and these United States. Eventually, China will come on board with the help of the Soviets. How does Hegel influence the post-war world? We can see Hegel so much leading up to the First and the Second World Wars. How do we see that, if you do, developing after the war?
Well, I see that the world wars themselves were a failure of Hegel because the counter-synthetic, under normal circumstances, doesn't want anything to do with the dialectic. It's not involved. Given a reactionary space, it's allowed to just continue on as it always has. As again, kind of like how the Amish are. They don't really have to participate. They can if they want, and there's places for them to do that. There's mediating areas for them. But it's entirely voluntary on both parties. We don't have to follow under Amish rules, and they don't have to follow under ours necessarily. In some cases they do, but in many cases they don't. They have a lot of autonomy. When you prevent that from happening, you force the Amish to find someone to join. And sometimes it'll be in the example I brought forward, to be the taxi cab company, sometimes be the taxi cab worker. Sometimes, most problematically, it's with a new regime. And what fascism is, in my estimation, is where the thesis and antithesis of liberalism and socialism, where it's supposed to synthesize and sublate into something that's a negotiation that's neither both, but kind of is both. It's a bit of a mixture of those two. Instead of us getting that nice, happy medium, that where we have a social safety net, but we're still having free markets, yada yada. Fascism starts taking all that energy up by absorbing the counter-synthetic into itself. It starts aligning with the counter-synthetic. It starts saying to the counter-synthetic, hey, I hear you. And unlike the other two, I'll actually do something about it. I'll actually provide the things that you are asking for because I have the power and I have the critique. I am not with the establishment, so I'm fighting the establishment, like the socialists fighting the liberal establishment. But I'm also not materialist. I'm idealist, like the thesis, like the liberals. So I'm going to be at your back. I got you. They're lying, but that's what they're saying. And that's where they get their power from. Without the counter-synthetic being marginalized in the early 20th century, I would argue that World War II would not really have happened. Right? It really came about as a result of the counter-synthetic needing to find a place. The whole philosophy and artistic movement of Romanticism comes from this. Like Romanticism is the counter-synthetic making its presence known, making its presence felt. And it's out of the Romantics that we get fascism. Without the Romantics, there's no fascism. There's no desire to reinvent the nation because we're happy with things the way they are. Or if we're not happy with things are, we know what we are wanting to accomplish. We know the direction we want to head in. Whereas the fascists simply have the phrase, what we're going to do is we're going to redo the traditional. We're going to recreate old power structures, not by bringing the old power structures back in power. We're not doing that. We're creating brand new ones with us as the power. And so because Hegel made that error of not including the counter-synthesis, we then got World War II. And what ends up happening once the synthetic takes in the counter-synthesis, the thesis and the antithesis start ganging up on the synthesis. They have to in order for their own survival, and they become polarized. Instead of themselves seeing themselves as um, representatives of ideas, they see themselves as the actual idea itself, needing to defend themselves, and so they polarize and they rip apart instead of sublating like they're supposed to.
So that would be one's Cold War, right? The
Mm-hmm.
so-called liberal United States and the so-called communist Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Um, and to your earlier point, having clarified that, there was the fascist slogan, "Deeds, not actions."
Mm-hmm.
Deeds, not action. So that frustration, which is almost intentionally built into liberalism, in order that emotion not take over in this country here, in Connecticut, in these United States. Um, the system is deliberately meant to slow things down so that emotion doesn't take over.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get into the earlier part of this broadcast about the internal versus the external, and we can see how these systems are trying to address this even some centuries gone by. So here in America, we have, that governor, like on a pedal, on a gasoline pedal, to slow down emotion so that we can think through things logically, and we can plug this all into Hegel and earlier points, the internal and the external. And
Mm-hmm.
then we see, as you pointed out with fascism, um, that adolescent. I say this, with something of a romantic fascist personality myself. Um, that adolescent idea of the emotion dominating and taking over, and the youthful rebellion, and you had mentioned in the 20th century the fascist movements. I'm also thinking with something that I published lately, the Irish nationalist movement in the late 19th, early 20th century, leading to the rising and the Anglo-Irish War. I mean, those were it's not as a slander, but in reality, proto-fascist. Those were adolescents of myself being sympathetic to certain strands of thought here. That the emotional exuberance will dominate everything. And so you can see that even before the traditional fascist movements in the 30s and the 40s, let's say, you can see that asserting itself in other ways in the Irish and in these marginal um,
Mhm.
civilizations to Europe.
Yeah, yeah. You do not want the synthesis to be the mediator between the dialectic and the countersynthesis. At the end of the day, that is not a good thing. You also don't want any of the other sides to be that mediator either.
Well, but there's a hell of a hangover too to the Irish
Hmm.
in so far as when you kind of sober up. That's the Irish in the 1920s and 30s. So you have this adolescent rebellion against the order, and you kind of get what you want for a hot second, and then the synthesis and the antithesis reasserts themselves in those specific circumstances, and then you have maybe unresolved. You can speak to this post-war in the bigger picture of America and the Soviet Union.
Hmm.
Then you have what happens in the 1990s and 2000s until today. Do we see a similar hangover between the synthesis and the antithesis?
Yeah, because ultimately the socialists lost. They lost the war in the 90s. And so, as a result, the liberal thesis, stood unchallenged and arrogant. And that's when we saw the crack start to form. The first crack was a reestablished countersynthesis through Russia. So, I want to make something very clear. Russia is not a genuine countersynthesis in like I don't think Putin is actually a good guy. I don't think that Russia's living like this sort of idealized countersynthetic role. What I think they have done is they've absorbed it, they've taken it onto themselves, and they've sort of directed the kind of ire that the countersynthetic has, and they're sort of playing it like a conductor in an orchestra. And so, in many ways, Russia is acting as a countersynthesis, albeit a toxic one. And China is, in a certain sense, allied with Russia, despite the fact that they should not be allies, because China's acting as an antithesis, despite the fact they're not actually antithesis. They're actually far more countersynthetic than they are antithesis. They are the genuine countersynthetics in a weird way, except they're toxic by also trying to overlap with the American antithesis. Um, And as a result of all of these overlapping identities, things get really, really unstable. Ideally, you have a separation. Ideally, you would have a European thesis and a Chinese antithesis, with maybe a Central European synthesis or Nordic synthesis. And the United States would be the counter synthesis, right? Or maybe Russia would be part of the synthesis, but the United States would also be playing the role of counter-synthesis because we are the establishment of the global order. We're the ones that are the world police. We're protecting the trade routes with our navy. We are the counter-synthetic in this context. And we're very uninterested in European progressivism as a rule. So it would make sense for us to have a space at the table to be that counter-synthetic voice. But we've lost that counter-synthetic voice, and we lost it to Russia. And I would argue that a lot of our problems have to do with this. And this isn't me even mentioning the void and the outsider. Those are different elements that aren't really the scope here, but they are also involved. And when they are starting and when they're adopted by different elements of the meta dialectic and overlapping, that's not good. You want there to be nice, clear, defined separations within the dialectic, where there's one person that's acting as the accelerator, one person acting as the brake, and the other person who's sort of a negotiation in between, the driver. You want that all to be different from the person who built the car and the person who negotiated the price, and the person who's making vegetables, and the person who put the vegetables in the car. Right? Those are very different groups of people. You do not want them to be the same person.
Just on my end, Adam, do you know about a filmmaker from Britain called Adam Curtis? Adam Curtis.
I am not familiar. Can you go into more
Okay,
detail?
well, to the audience, I will put you in touch, with some of his work because you're hitting in the neighborhood of some of the things he brings up. But he's worked in the past for the BBC. A lot of his documentaries have come out from that organization. But the audience will be well advised to look into this in terms of how, especially with a documentary called Hyper Normalization, if you want
Mm-hmm.
a real, you know, merely 4 hour synopsis of what Adams laid out in terms of harnessing the counter synthesis for yourself, if you're Vladimir Putin, for yourself, or, the so called outside force, how the power structure wrangles it in. I'll recommend that documentary, Hyper Normalization, and then after that, if you have merely 8 or 10 hours to give to this series, you will look up from Adam Curtis, The Century of the Self, how Edward Bernays and Freudian psychology um, became very, very dominant and very useful for certain power nodes.
Yeah, yeah, and in order to really sell this idea of a meta dialectic, that's really kind of the focus of what I'm talking about. I think it's useful to borrow from Nietzsche his idea of Apollo versus Dionysus. And I have it up on the screen right now. Um, Basically, the idea here is that there's these two fundamental bases
Adam, do
for.
you want that on the screen share there?
Oh, sure, I can do that.
So we have to give us a second here for the live viewers. Dionysus and Apollo.
Uh,
You see where it says present down below?
Yep, I got you. I got you. Do you see it now?
Yeah, here we go.
It's just the
Not Conan
Wikipedia.
tonight. Not Conan tonight. We got some Nietzsche.
So the idea here is that you have Apollo, who is the god of the sun. He represents, uh, rational thought, prudence, purity, and reason, skill. Right? That's sort of his shtick. And then you have Dionysus, who is the god of religious ecstasy, irrationality, passion, and chaos. And these two are, in a certain sense, opposed to each other. They're sort of two sides of the human mind. And I think that's somewhat true, but I think that it's an incomplete picture because Apollo and Dionysus don't really exist in the human mind in their purest forms. These are more icons or, or idealized versions or extreme versions of these concepts. The extreme versions do exist in a sense, but they're not the main drivers of human thought and human activity. And I would argue that the actual relationship is vis-a-vis five other gods that also end up playing a role. And Apollo ends up being the countersynthesis. He actually ends up playing that role, whereas Dionysus ends up playing the role of the void. Uh, what ends up happening is that Apollo has a representative and Dionysus has a representative. Apollo's representative is Hermes, and Dionysus's representative is Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft and sorcery and power. And they themselves have a proxy battle, if you will, through the dialectic. And the dialectic, I would argue, is the triumvirate Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. Zeus and Hades form the thesis and antithesis, and Poseidon ends up the synthesis. It's kind of the in between, the tumultuous storm, the generator of progress itself. And Hecate and Hermes end up playing kind of a director seat or a messenger seat between themselves as representatives of these two more idealized components of human thought, of logic versus illogic.
Great. I'm wrestling with a button down below here, but yes, thank you very much for that point there, because you can see how these internal archetypes are shown externally in these mythologies, and it's a little bit more complicated than simply, look at these old-fashioned people and how they were taken in by these silly stories. And I'm having this discussion with a student as well. Uh, how base, frankly, how base our presentation of pre-Christian and pre-Islamic uh, mythologies were. I mean, you're laying out a whole level of psycho history that we're often deprived of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this I think allows us to have different allow us to think about our history from from this type of lens, so we can see how, in a weird way, Russia's trying to pretend to be Apollo, and you can kind of see the corruption that Russia's playing by not being actually Apollo, by being more of an opportunist, right? Russia's more like Hecate, but it's pretending to be Apollo, and China ought to be Hades, right? But it's really actually Apollo in disguise. But it's meant to be Hades. It's meant to be the critic, the one who challenges Zeus and says, "Hold on, I don't think you got all this in the right spot." Right? And the United States, which should be playing the role of Apollo, is instead Zeus. We're the rulers, we're the advancers of progress. We're not really supposed to be. In Europe is turning into this weird synthesis. Europe is being Poseidon, being the storm. Again, things aren't really working all that well.
But where does 4chan and Reddit come into this synthesis here, or this amalgamation? Where does 4chan and Reddit? Maybe this will be our last main point here.
Well, I mean, I would say that 4chan is really oriented around Hecate or Dionysus, primarily Hecate. Right? Hecate is sort of the goddess of the written word in a sorts, and she's opposed to Hermes, the god of communication. So, whereas Hermes is the one that actually communicates throughout the meta dialectic, the mediator mediates between the outsider, Apollo, and the dialectic. Right? It's really the busy bee for going through them. It doesn't directly interface with the void because that's a bad idea. The only one who touches the void is Hecate. Hecate's the only one who has any understanding of the void to deal with it. Um, whereas, I'm sorry, I lost my point. I
Uh,
was, we were
uh,
talking about
4chan and Reddit.
4chan,
4chan.
right? So 4chan would end up being Hecate, and Reddit is a corrupted Hermes. Reddit would be a corrupted Hermes, I think. They're not really doing their jobs the way they're supposed to. Uh, Reddit, through its censorship process, is not actually fulfilling the role of Hermes. Hermes is meant to be just a messenger, not not a Thesis, not an Apollo. He's not meant to be anything other than just a messenger. You ever heard the phrase "Don't shoot the messenger"? That's supposed to be Hermes. And 4chan is Hecate. They're not really doing anything wrong, really. They're just not helpful always. Hecate's not really meant to be all that helpful. Uh, Generally speaking, 4chan shouldn't be directly interfacing with the dialectic. That's probably the bad thing, but it's not really 4chan's fault. It's more the dialectic's fault for letting 4chan in. Hecate shouldn't be directly talking to Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. She has no business talking to them directly. So if she is, it's Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon's fault. They're the ones that invited her in, and they end up paying the price for it.
Well, there's a lot there. That's for certain. Any final points, Adam? Here.
This is again just my current thinking on the matter. I'm by no means an expert. I'm not an expert in Hegel either. I am probably the last person alive who should be commenting on Hegel, but it just so happened that this idea popped in my head, and I was like, "Huh, this seems kind of interesting." I wanted to explore the idea. Um, but I mean, that's really it. As long as it's understood that this is just some random thought in my head, that's really what I would like to leave with.
Well, I don't think it's random. You've certainly thought out these points very, very thoroughly, and I hope the audience, and we had quite a bit of viewers over the past hour or so. I hope the audience has seen how the points that Professor Myers has laid out fit into not just our present dialectic, which I mean, almost like a electrical socket. I mean, they fit perfectly. The dynamics with 4chan and Reddit and different political movements here in America and Europe and NATO and whatever, but also in history, we see these perennial archetypes and these perennial scaffoldings assert themselves, and it's remarkable. I'm very impressed by this past presentation here, because it's using different language, but it's saying something that other scholars besides Professor Myers that I've read privately have said, and it's most remarkable. So thank you for laying these out and putting this in a very a very digestible synthesis here.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. So for the audience here, as we knock off, and Adam, stay on for a hot second here. For the audience, Professor Myers is available for tutoring in mathematics as well as logic here at the Institute. So just write us in our typical email address down below in the description, and we'll get you set up there for your studies. Any final words, Adam?
No, I think that's about it. I'm glad you had me. Glad we had this conversation. I hope people found it interesting.
Very good. I should hope that we have a follow-up in the future.
Mhm.